authorization from EV for the send it to you. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So, welcome to the PhD defense of Marcus Kieslich. I've been appointed by my colleagues to be the chairman of this PhD defense. So I will give you some detail on the organization. I think that we will give the floor for half an hour. Yes. And then I give the floor to your two referees, official referees, Tina Ramonilazza and Olivier Chanel. Then I give then it will be I will give the floor to Yves Ménard and Jürgen Meyerhoff and Raphaël Préger, me, and Jean-Michel as the supervisor in the last position. It's okay for you? So the floor is yours for 30 minutes.
Dear President of the PhD Defense Committee, dear members of the committee, I first want to thank you for giving me the honor of presenting and assisting and evaluating the work of my PhD thesis, which is about the monetary valuation of ecosystem service in this event in the deliberative workshops. I also want to thank all my colleagues, my family and friends who are following this defense in this room or online. A few weeks ago, Germany was heavily touched by rainfalls and inundations. One of the perhaps most famous pictures is this one of Erftstadt. And what is remarkable in this picture is that it's clearly separated between an area which is touched by landslides, whereas another area is relatively intact. And this corresponds to different types of land use. So we have agricultural land at the right and an urban park at the left. Talking about different land uses means the provision of different ecosystem services. So agricultural land provides food for the population, whereas urban parks have a recreational value and provide erosion control. So I do not claim that having more or less erosion control could have changed many things about the landslides, but I think what comes clear is that accounting for ecosystem services in public decision-making can have a clear impact on human well-being on a local scale. And therefore the question is, how are ecosystem services accounted for in decision-making? Well, in an ideal scenario, we have in balance the different types of social welfare generated by the different land users. So for example, at the right, we have the agricultural land with tax earnings from the farmer who's cultivating the land, who is creating jobs, and as before, the ecosystem service of food provision. And at the left, we have the ecosystem services from the urban park, so the recreational value, erosion control, and carbon sequestration. So when we are taking these different benefits into account, we therefore have a situation of equilibration. But if ecosystem services are not well taken into account, what happens is that decision-making, for example, an attribution of public land, tends to promote solutions with tangible benefits. So the tax earnings and the job creation would be more important in the decisions. So the decision is not only based on whether different benefits are more or less tangible. Also within ecosystem services, we have some which are more or less tangible. For example, we have the aesthetic value of a landscape. We have spiritual values attached to landscape patterns, and we have also symbolic values, in this case attributed to trees. So how can we account for these types of values in decision making? Something which is suggested is to have what we call deliberative valuation. So having workshops and where participants discuss about the issue, therefore revealing how they attach values to this issue, which can then be taken into account in the decision-making process. Therefore, my thesis is concerned with two main questions. How can valuation foster the recognition of ecosystem services in public decision-making? And can deliberation improve the valuation of less tangible ecosystem services? Therefore, after this introduction, I will come to a literature review, which is concerned with the question of how the utility of ecosystem service valuation can be enhanced in decision-making. Then we employed an empirical study about the preference for ecosystem services derived from the landscapes in the Cevennes. I will present how did we prepare this study and how we organized the logistics. I will present the results about the preference for the landscape design in the Cevennes area, and then come to the results concerning the impact of deliberation on these preferences and on valuation in general. I will then conclude and give some perspectives of my work. So, coming to the literature review. When we are concerned about the question of how ecosystem service valuation is useful for decision making, when looking into the literature, there's what we call the classic role of valuation, which is the provision of information. So we are having an ecosystem service which is evaluated. This information is passed to the decision-making sphere. Decision-making is taking action or taking several decisions. This is implemented and then re-affects the service we initially valued. So implementation is directly depending on the decision-making sphere. In our literature review, we extended this model, notably by adding two things. First, we said that there is a certain interaction between the implementation stage and decision-making stage, by assuming that if the implementation is facilitated, the decision maker is more probable to take favorable action. And secondly, so the second innovation is that we accounted for the literature of science policy interfaces in our review, so that valuation not only is going directly to the decision maker, but information and guidance is provided to implementation sphere and to the decision-making sphere within these science policy interfaces. So what does this mean for the valuation of ecosystem services? The valuation should anticipate structural need of the implementation stage. What does this mean? This means that when we are looking into the implementation research literature, there are two very known approaches. First, the bottom-up approach. So a decision is taken at the bottom and then applied at higher levels. And in our analysis, we show that especially deliberative approaches are very convenient to this type of implementation, whereas traditional monetary valuation is more convenient to what we call top-down implementation. So a decision is taken at the top and then applied to lower levels. In any case, science policy interfaces can interact for both implementation context and provide information and guidance simultaneously to the implementation and decision-making sphere. But what are these science policy interfaces? These are combinations of different actors, so researchers, practitioners, and decision makers from different disciplines and from different administrative levels, which are therefore engaged in what we call transdisciplinary process. So in total, in our review, to answer the question of the enhancements of the utility of ecosystem service variation, we show that the exploitation of complementary methods enhances this utility, and that transdisciplinary processes, especially in combination with science policy interfaces, are able to make ecosystem service variation more relevant for decision making. We could publish these results in the journal Ecological Economics. Now I will come to the second part of my thesis, which is the empirical study about the preferences for ecosystem services derived from the Cevennes landscapes. So what we did was we applied these deliberative workshops, and within these workshops we had a what we call discrete choice experiment, where we asked respondents about their preferences of forest cover, the proportion of different tree species, the tourism development, the conservation of cultural heritage, and an annual payment as donation to local associations. How did we apply this study? In order to have our final questionnaire, which we had in these deliberative workshops, we had 4 focus groups and pilot tests in order to construct it. And when we applied our deliberative workshops in Montpellier and in the Cevennes, we separated groups into treatment and control groups. In treatment groups, we gave the basic information. Then we discussed about the issue of the landscapes in the Cevennes. Then we had our main questionnaire with the discrete choice experiment, and I will come later to this indicator statements. Whereas in control groups, we changed the order of the discussion and the questionnaire phase, so that the difference in questionnaires is due to the discussion being included for the treatment groups, but not for control groups. And therefore, comparing treatment and control groups gives us information about the deliberation and how deliberation affected the preferences. So how were the preparation and the logistics? First of all, we had to show what the landscapes and the preference in the Cevennes is really about. So it's marked or heavily influenced by grazing agriculture and pastoralism. But due to abandonment, natural reforestation took place. So therefore the question is, should we conserve these cultural landscapes? And how should we conserve, and should we, the cultural heritage in the region, and how the tourism in this region should evolve? We tried to answer this question in 23 workshops with a total of 243 participants. They inscribed into our workshops by the use of posters, a radio interview, local newspaper articles, and information provided on our own homepage. They were compensated by a nice buffet during which they discussed about the issue, and a gift of local products in order to compensate their coming. What were the results? So, confounding treatment and control groups, what is the general image that the people have about the landscape in the Cevennes? In order to answer this question, we had therefore a discrete choice experiment, and then which can provide an economic valuation of the preferences. And we had the indicator statements. So indicator statements are statements belonging to each of the attributes, which are stating several benefits that could be associated to the attribute. And then participants could choose whether they were unaware of this benefit, whether they found it not important, or whether they considered it within their choices. Based on these indicator statements, we could have, or we applied a multiple correspondence analysis and had some clustering in order to identify groups of individuals who have similar perceptions about the benefits associated to the attributes in our choice experiment. Therefore, we could identify so-called ecosystem service bundles. These are ecosystem services that repeatedly appear together across time and space. Coming to the results of our discrete choice experiment, we developed a mixed logit model throughout several alternatives which we tested, and this shows the main coefficient of our attributes. So forest cover is associated negatively to utility. Then the tree species attribute, the tourism infrastructure and cultural heritage is positively attributed to utility, and all this for our Cevennes sample. So we could say that people in this event wanted to have less forested landscapes. They wanted to have an equilibrated proportion between broadleaf forests and coniferous forests. They preferred to have medium development of tourism infrastructure, and they wanted to conserve cultural heritage. How did these results change in comparison to our groups in Montpellier? Finally, there wasn't much that changed. The only thing that changed was we had a significant influence of age, so notably shown by our interaction terms right here, which makes also a little bit more difficult the interpretation of the coefficients above. So we could interpret this coefficient as the preferences for forest cover if an individual would have the age of 0. And so in average, for every supplementary year, this coefficient decreases by this amount of minus 0.023, and we can easily calculate that above the age of 25, this coefficient gets negative, and the tree species coefficient gets positive, so that we find the same preferences or similar preferences as in our Cevennes group. Based on these results, we simulated willingness to pay for different scenarios. So we constructed a business as usual scenario out of our discrete choice experiment, notably by saying that we still have natural reforestation and we have an equilibrated proportion between broadleaf forests and coniferous forests. We had an economic support scenario, which means that we wanted to support forestry, so there's many reforestation, and we had more tourism infrastructure in order to improve or to support tourism. And we had a conservation scenario with a conservation of the cultural heritage, the cultural landscape, and the cultural heritage in the landscape. And what we can see is that for both groups in Cevennes and Montpellier, the conservation scenario was largely preferred by our participants based on the estimations of our mixed logit model. Now I will come to the analysis of our indicator statements. So what we can see here is when we have regrouped different people having similar preferences for the benefits, what is their degree of consideration of the ecosystem services in their choices. So first, we had one cluster, the blue one, which had a high consideration of nearly all ecosystem services, especially those that are related to forests. Secondly, we had a cluster which had especially preferences for aquapastoralism. And then within this cluster, people from the Cevennes area were overrepresented. And finally, in the third cluster, we had more young people and people having less prior experience with the Cevennes landscapes, who had especially preferences for carbon sequestration and less tangible benefits such as spiritual values and contribution to environmental identity. So what we have here is people having the same or similar perceptions of the same ecosystem services together. So we could interpret this as a demand for ecosystem services. And this is one of the main results of the landscape preferences for the Cevennes, which I want to summarize right now. So we found that regarding the landscapes, conservation of cultural landscapes and forests composed of endemic broadleaf forests or broadleaf species was preferred and supported. People wanted to have a moderate tourism development, and this vision more or less corresponds to the national parks policy. However, the perception of the ecosystem services from the landscapes was quite heterogeneous, especially by age. And this could have some impact on how we want to communicate on the richness of the landscapes in awareness-raising campaigns. Furthermore, as we have seen that many services have been integrated into the analysis of the indicator statements, ecosystem service bundles are a useful tool for transdisciplinary processes as suggested in the first chapter, but not yet frequently used by economists. We showed that the attributes of discrete choice experiments are possible indicators for ecosystem service bundles. But as we have done, they should be refined by qualitative analysis, as with the indicator statements. Coming now to our results regarding the impact of deliberation on the preferences for ecosystem services in this event. I talked already a lot about deliberation, but what is deliberation? It is when participants can speak and listen to others' opinions, can ask questions to clarify difficult issues, and can get time in order to reflect upon the issue for themselves. So in our study, we wanted to know how is the impact of deliberation on the preferences for the civil landscapes, on the recognition of these less tangible non-material ecosystem services, and therefore we made a comparison between control and treatment groups. So in this graph, we have the comparison between the estimators in our final mixed logit model for the Montpellier group. So estimators and their confidence intervals between deliberative groups in red and non-deliberative groups in blue. And what we can see that there's a decrease in deliberative groups for the attribute of tourism and cultural heritage. So people in deliberative groups stated to have lower preferences for tourism and cultural heritage. But another thing was interesting, it's that when we are regarding the size of the confidence intervals, that changed between deliberative groups and non-deliberative groups, such that in deliberative groups, it's much smaller than in non-deliberative groups. And we therefore ask, is that a possible sign for what we call preference homogenization? So preferences get more similar within deliberation for our Montpellier sample. Therefore, we looked up again our indicator statements. So I remind that people could choose whether they considered a benefit, whether they found it not important, or whether they were unaware. And so we calculated this degree of consideration for all attributes and for each attribute itself. And what we can see when we are looking into the unaware column, the difference between non-deliberative and deliberative groups is that much or less people stated that they were unaware of a certain benefit, whereas for nearly all different categories, the considered and not important statements increased at least slightly. So in Montpellier, what could happen in order to have this preference homogenization is that we have an information effect that enables participants to construct their preferences and therefore decide on whether a certain benefit is considered or not, or should not considered within their choices. How do these results change for our groups in this event? First, comparing the estimators of our mixed logit model for the event groups and with their confidence intervals, we show that we have the same differences, or the same difference between deliberative groups and non-deliberative groups for the tourism attribute. So as in Montpellier, Savannah people tend to have less preferences for tourism when they have deliberative. But what we also see is that differently than in Montpellier, the size of the confidence intervals is higher for deliberative groups than for non-deliberative groups. And therefore, parallelly as for Montpellier, we ask, does this mean that we have preference heterogenization in this event sample? And again, we look up in our indicator statements. So when we are looking for all different attributes and service categories together, there's no clear change. So the impact of deliberation on the preference, so on the recognition of preferences, is not as big as in Montpellier. But if we are looking on the cultural heritage attribute, and if we are classifying the benefits into different service categories, we see that we have a shift from non-important answers to considered answers. And we have a shift from more considered provisioning ecosystem services, which decreased, to the profit of non-material ecosystem services. So we have a shift of less tangible benefits of ecosystem services to, so we have a shift from tangible benefits to less tangible benefits due to deliberation in this event sample. And I will come back to this issue in a few moments. I first want to summarize, therefore, these results of deliberation. We found a decreasing support for high tourism development for both samples. We had indications for preference homogenization for the Montpellier sample due to an information effect, which would mean that deliberation could be especially useful if we have a low degree of familiarity with the issue. For the event sample, we had signs for preference heterogenization, perhaps by the revelation of differences in transcendental values, because it's these that are most associated to cultural heritage and to non-material ecosystem services, as we have seen for the indicator statements. And Jean-Michel pointed me on a citation which quite well illustrates this issue. It's from the French poet Charles Baudelaire. Le monde ne marche que par le malentendu. C'est par le malentendu universel que tout le monde s'accorde. Car si, par malheur, on se comprenait, on ne pourrait jamais s'accorder. Ce qui, which in English would mean, the world only works by misunderstanding. It's by misunderstanding that everybody can agree on something. Because if accidentally we would understand each other, we could never agree. And so perhaps this is something what happens in this event sample. So they reveal transcendental values, but they also saw their differences in how they perceive these transcendental values. And therefore this made their preferences more heterogeneous than before the deliberation. We also see in our results that we have a higher general quality of the valuation, so a higher recognition of non-material ecosystem services, a higher quality of trade-offs, and a higher satisfaction with the valuation exercise among participants. That, as can be indicated by our only 10% confidence intervals which we chose, we had some sample size problems. And therefore, as we have did it, in order to have a clear interpretation of the results, this deliberation should be complemented with qualitative analysis, as with our indicator statements. So coming to the results of the whole thesis, the conclusion and perspectives, we can say that transdisciplinary processes, including implementation, enhance the utility of ecosystem service valuation. Ecosystem service bundles is a powerful concept for transdisciplinary settings. The economic valuation by discrete choice experiments is feasible, but still unexploited. The use of deliberation has different consequences and function of ex-ante knowledge. If participants are already familiar with the topic, deliberation can reveal transcendental values. In this case, it is even more useful for co-construction within projects than for valuation. Whereas when the topic is complex and reveals unfamiliar relationships, deliberation is an effective tool for valuation, especially if non-material ecosystem services are affected. So how these results could guide further research or could be invested in further research? First, about the transdisciplinary processes and methods. We have seen that what economics can furnish is trade-off analysis. In trade-off analysis, in order to derive these commendations for public land use planning, And therefore, a combination of discrete choice experiment and qualitative methods for the economic valuation of ecosystem service bundles can be furnished. And there is still some research to do. Experimental approaches of deliberation means that we have much methodological innovation in this field, but not yet a lot of empirical evidence. So really testing the influence of deliberation. So when and how should deliberation complement the valuation of ecosystem services? And also attention has to be paid to the implementation context of the valuation of ecosystem services. Attention is also what I want you, what I want to thank you for. And I also want to thank Jean-Michel for these last 5 wonderful years having supervised my thesis. Je veux également remercier Mika pour ces 5 années incroyables avec plein de souvenirs, avec un investissement incroyable. Tout le bâtiment 26, mes copains, pour l'ambiance pendant ces 5 années. Und natürlich meine Familie und Freunde zu Hause oder wahrscheinlich gerade draußen auf dem Campus spielend, für die Unterstützung, für das Vertrauen, dieses Projekt so zu Ende zu bringen. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for your clear presentation. I'm going to give the floor to Tina Ramboni-Lazza, research professor at the University Dijon, for your first referee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Jean-Michel for associating me with this jury. When he asked me to be one of the referees of Marcus' work, he reminded me of our exchanges several years ago over a cup of tea, which would make me the right examiner. At that time, he told me that a young PhD student was developing a deliberative valuation approach to ecosystem services assessment in the Seven Park, and I replied that as a practitioner, I'm both enthusiastic and skeptical about this method. But today I have to say that the conceptual and empirical work provided by Marcus gives us some solid results and arguments to pursue research effort on this method. And as I am mentioned in my report, the thesis develops an ambitious empirical research, and Marcus has succeeded on 2 aspects. He has succeeded in positioning his work within the ecological economics literature while keeping a balance between a critical view of standard economic valuation and methodological pragmatism to move forward. Secondly, the credibility of the research is based on the field work and the use of advanced econometric technique, and he had brought some methodological novelty. I want to say it includes the generation of data with the split sample test method to address the causal effect of a deliberation, distinguishing a treatment group sample from the control group. I want also to mention the second part of the questionnaire, which deals with the individual perception of the scenario's attributes to figure out the kinds of values or knowledge that underlies individual choices. He also has developed a quite sophisticated econometric analysis, supplementing these with multivariate analysis, a statistical approach underused in economics, while keeping in mind the operability of his research results. And I also, finally, also appreciate the care with which he described the sociological issues of the event and the various trade-offs which are necessary for its future. And for all of this, congratulations, Marcus. Having said that, because this is the rule of the game, I have a number of remarks and comments that I have developed in my report. Some of them were answered, get their answer during the oral presentations. Others will have their answer for this defense, but I will perhaps take 4 of them to start the discussion. And we can interact. I ask or I ask the question, and you can. Yeah. We can proceed like this. Thank you. My first remarks concern the deliberative survey procedure. And as you know, the strength of a deliberative approach is to provide an individual respondent opportunity to think and to learn during the participative session, then make rational choices for repeated rounds. And in your procedure, individual learning is not taken into account as it was to be. This can affect the quality of the choice data and at last the main property of preferences that are inferred from these data. So with respect to the economic valuation, this is some weakness of the procedure.
Yeah, so first, thank you for the remarks. And an alternative to what you have said would have therefore been to have perhaps several deliberative rounds in order to account for this learning process during the rounds of deliberation. We also thought of having this kind of analysis, but in our test rounds, we already saw that given our timing restraints, there was some complications. Because already the questionnaire lasted 1 hour approximately, and we had 1 hour of discussion. And as we didn't want to have the whole deliberative workshops lasting much more than 2 hours, although we really never reached to keep it under 2 hours. Notably because of fatigue effects, for example, we chose, although this is a certain limit for our results, to not have several deliberative rounds. Another thing for me is that as we had these indicator statements, which gave some supplementary information within the questionnaire, perhaps I will come back to this. Doesn't it? So it's right here. So as we had some indicator statements within our questionnaires, this could have provided also additional information for the participants. So if we had make, for example, I will just take here this control group. So having a questionnaire, then a discussion, and then again a questionnaire, the additional knowledge in the second questionnaire with a discrete choice experiment could have included, of course, the information from the discussion, but also the information they received from these indicator statements, because we also had the situation that participants said that, if I have known this, what I read right now, I would have chosen differently. And therefore, we would have a learning effect based on our questionnaire itself, and because of the discussion, which had been confounded, and therefore there would have been additional difficulty to separate these two effects within our data.
So you compensate the absence of round 2 by discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you. The second comment, it concerns also the deliberative survey. How can you be sure that the valuation outcomes of deliberative choice were not affected by issue related to group power dynamics and not from the deliberative process in itself as a social interactions and exchanges.
So this is in general in deliberative exercises is an issue. So it's just the fact that somebody is really monopolizing the discussion, heavily influencing the other participants. And of course it is. And therefore we also chose, but I haven't analyzed yet this type of data. We asked participants whether they felt that somebody has taken too much part in the discussion. And although not having yet looked up the impact, I can say that surprisingly low degree of participants stated this response. So they felt that it was more or less equilibrated, but I have to admit that's still something which has to be investigated within our data, and especially using the transcripts we have made of the discussions. So my main concern was to have this data, because it's me and Miguel who had the discussions, and therefore can really make this proper data, so that to clean it, because we understand it and we know the context. And therefore my priority first was to have this data and analyzing it afterwards. And this is therefore also something which I could have mentioned in the perspective. So analyzing this transcript data.
I come to the main remark for this thesis, which concerns chapter 3.
Yeah.
Yes, in this chapter, you set up an econometric analysis based on data set that combines choices obtained from a protocol survey involving deliberation before choice experiments and choice data obtained with a protocol in which deliberation took place after choice experiment. And formally, the data from, as you know, the data from the control group is supposed to be used to validate the choice model of the treatment group. But it's true in your model, you are wise to recombine the two samples to get a better model given the sample size was too small. But I have a great comment. You have no validation of this combined data model at this point of at this step of your thesis. So how can you define these reasons without the robust test?
So therefore the concern is that I should have tested this deliberation effect before analyzing the data in the third chapter. I think this is true, and I think it's a lack of communication of my part within the thesis. I think first there was a slightly different objective of this chapter, because it was, as we have been engaged in this in many transdisciplinary measures, so having ecosystem bundles and the economic valuation, the aim was more to say, if a decision maker would ask me, what is the result of landscape preferences? So what is important for me as a decision maker? I wanted to give like a general response, all groups confounded. And therefore I didn't make at the beginning the distinction between deliberative groups and non-deliberative groups. And secondly, I wasn't sure about not how to test, but several difficulties in order to really test this deliberation effect, because as, for example, it suggested there could have been a wall test. But for me, there were several difficulties in how to include the interaction terms, because normally what you should have done is that we have interaction terms measuring the impact of deliberation on each of the alternatives. But as in the paper presented by and Norton, these interaction terms appear to be not very robust, and therefore the wall test based on these perhaps not very robust measurements of the deliberation effect, for me would have been not with a lot of power, because So first, the interaction terms itself are not that robust. Secondly, as we are in a non-linear framework, the Wald test also itself is not stable in non-linear transformations of the model. And this would, for example, have affected the payment attribute, because as it's in logarithm statements, in order to make it clear, as in linear models, it should have been transformed non-linearly, and there the Wald test is not stable to these non-linear statements. So I think what I should have done, and therefore I'm very grateful for this comment, is just to show a little bit how the deliberation affected the different attributes of our choice. Therefore, saying, yeah, there may be some differences especially in the tourism attribute. For some, also in the cultural heritage attribute. I think with a higher sample size, there would also have been an effect for the tree species attribute, but showing that this impact wouldn't have changed much in the interpretation of the results, but that there are differences in any case. So I really take this comment very serious, that when presenting the results of this third chapter, they should communicate on the differences between deliberative and non-deliberative.
Perhaps the last remark that does not expect an answer. When I read the document, I was one regret because you reason all your work on the concept of bundles of ecosystem services, but in the end, your valuations were summarized on the basis of a willingness to pay value for each attribute. But during the oral presentation, I remember that you make some scenarios valuation, but thank you. It's a good point.
Yeah, for me, this also was a little bit important because, of course, economics is a consequentialist science. There's a big debate whether economics is capable to treat certain values, especially those in non-material benefits, which are guided also by intention, about moral, which are not well accounted for in a consequentialist framework. And therefore, instead of having values only based on ecosystem services, I wanted to make values having based only on the attributes, or even aggregate them within scenarios. So therefore, I'm aware of this limit of economic valuation, and also the fact that they wanted to have qualitative measures, not only because they were more easily to be furnished and to be complemented to our analysis. We could also have made some quantitative complementary analysis, for example, a scoring approach for each attribute, so that people could have considered or could have given a certain score to each benefit within each attribute, and then we could have disaggregated the value of an attribute into the simple benefits or the ecosystem services. And I think perhaps this multiply looking at the criticism which is received against this very to going so far and giving a value to especially non-material ecosystem services, I wanted to account for this criticism.
Thank you. I finished.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's time now to Olivier Chandel, research professor at Aix-Marseille School of Economics, to give you some comments about your works.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for your clear presentation and the huge work you did during this PhD thesis. So I found it very interesting, highly innovative, on an interesting topic of both national and international relevance. And you also show through this work your high standard of scholarship. Broadly, what you are tackling is the use of stated preference method to give a monetary value to goods, and especially to ecosystem services, which are goods that are not well defined And this is one of the weaknesses of this type of method, because it relies on the knowledge, the perception of the good by the respondents, but also on the information provided during the scenario. So what you propose is to add to this standard framework a deliberative phase, and this is quite interesting. From a general perspective, what I regret is the fact that you do not give enough information on the existing literature on the information, the use of information, and how the information provided in the scenario can affect the willingness to pay of the respondents. I think the place would be in the first, maybe in the first chapter, but it is already published. I think you add something to the existing literature, but you do not enough show what was the current literature at the time when you entered the field. So I think that when you are going to publish the 3 other chapters, depending on the subject and the direction, not for the 4th chapter, but for the 3rd chapter, I think that doing a little literature review on the importance of information would be relevant. Regarding the 1st chapter, it's already published, so I have nothing to say except what I just said now. Regarding the 2nd chapter, what I really appreciated is the real attention you pay to the focus groups and the pilot survey. You learned a lot from this, and usually did not pay enough attention to the treatment of the pilot and focus, because okay, we collect some information on, for instance, on the bid we have to use, something like that. We have some open comments that can be used, but generally we did not reframe completely the way we thought about the problem. And what you did, and you explained each step of this process, and you clearly get a lot of information of lessons from this focus group and pilot survey, and it's very interesting. I have one question at the end, but for now, 2 remarks. In the 2nd chapter, you tackled the issue of heterogeneity, and you used for that a mixed logit model, which is fine. And you also did a hierarchical clustering analysis. And I was wondering about the use of latent class models. It's something which exists for about 15 years. I know that maybe the size of your sample may have been a difficulty to apply this type of models, but did you consider these models along with the other choices available?
Yes, I considered to take it. I then decided more to go on nested target models, but I haven't applied yet for the data, because within latent class model, the different classes of people having similar preferences and therefore have so that there's a discrete distribution of the preferences regarding the attributes for the individuals. We'll say that it's the algorithm itself which decides on how people are grouped together. I think this is very interesting to be complementary our mixed logit and our bundles, and to compare each other. There, I fully agreed. Why I finally didn't choose that but preferred the nested logit is that I wanted to focus on this bundle approach, because finally, although I'm talking a lot about the economic valuation of ecosystem service bundles, finally I haven't done this step yet. So I have an economic valuation and I have the identification of ecosystem service bundles, and now these have to be merged. And I think their nested logit is a relatively good alternative, because the fact that somebody belongs to a certain cluster could be a good criterion for being in a specific nest, because as they perceive the ecosystem services in a similar way, the correlation between the alternatives they perceive could also be correlated based on these same factors. And therefore, I wanted further to merge my analysis of mixed logit and of the clustering approach and merge it within nested logit instead of having a complementary approach, which would have been latent class. But this is, of course, an alternative, and this could further enrich the analysis of how the preferences for the ecosystem services or for the landscape differ between different parts of the population. So the question was whether I want to have further complementary approaches to what I've already done. This could have been latent class, or whether I want to combine the findings of the two approaches I already had. This would have been nested logit, and this is, for instance, the model I want to pursue, and this can further be complemented by the latent class approach. So in further development of the research I already did, this is a possible solution, to have a further complementary approach and have further insight into how the preferences for ecosystem services was divided between different parts of the population.
Okay, thank you. My second remark was on the way you elicit the type of values respondents judge as being the most important for the 7 landscapes. You proposed currently a list with 5 items, closed-ended list, and this is nice, but this provides information at the very beginning of the survey to the respondents. And some of my colleagues in Marseille 20 years ago, when working in the Parc National of Camargue, used something which is quite new and not frequently used. It was to let people give the words that they consider correspond to landscapes, 7 landscapes. They provide absolutely no information at the beginning. They just let them give the words, and they write it as open comments, and they wait until the people stop. And this provides a ranking, and this also provides a list. And based on this, and based on analysis, you can group people depending on whether or not they, for instance, evocate the emblematic pink flamingo or not, or if they talk about salt or about issue regarding water, agricultural, the use of water for agricultural purposes, and for salt, producing salt, which are two use of the water that are not compatible due to the timing of the crops and due to the timing of the salt farming. And so I was wondering whether it may be a possibility in further surveys, obviously, because if you have done a survey you have not yet completed completely, so you're not going to spend time considering this. But in the future, do you think it would be something interesting to have different ways to tackle the same issue and say whether or not they are consistent?
A clear yes. So I think I looked up this study about the Camargue, and I was really astonished by the degree of information that provides. Although within the questionnaire, it doesn't last that long. So as you said, you're just writing some words, what you're associating to this event, and then these words are counted together, reclassified, and therefore you can choose how people to which different kind of values people belong when they think of this event. Of course, I think this will be a great approach to have similar studies in the future. At the beginning, we thought of that, but nearly immediately discarded the thinking of having an open question, because at the beginning, when we established our questionnaire, we were a little bit afraid of whether we believe in the timing. And having already a questionnaire of 1 hour, we just said the more open questions we have, the less we can control the duration of this questionnaire. But afterwards, of course, you know which questions you could have omitted within the questionnaire, and for example, replace this with this open question in order to have the values associated to this event before giving them additional information. So I think it would have been a good investment in terms of time during the questionnaire. And so therefore for future studies, I think this could be a good point to include.
And more generally, it provides you at the very early beginning of the study the state of knowledge of beliefs on what you are going to study, and after the deliberative approach, you can also compare the outcome with the ex-ante beliefs.
Yeah.
Regarding the third chapter, I have a couple of technical comments in the report, so I will not give them again. Just I would have been interested in knowing, you provide a lot of details on the estimation of the models and things you did, which is quite standard in textbooks, econometric textbooks. But the way you compute the willingness to pay, the average willingness to pay based on the results of the mixed models are a little bit less explored and less explained. And so I would have been curious to have more details on this. I have two other technical remarks. First, regarding the fact that I did not find, or did not remember having found a section or something about considering the attribute non-attendance. Because in this type of, in DCE, it may be that respondents consistently ignore one or several attributes. And if it is the cost attribute, it's a huge issue. If not, we can account for the fact that one of the attributes is systematically not considered in the study. So I did not find whether you tackle or consider this issue. And second, not linked, but also regarding the way people answer the question. Protest answers are something which are interesting. Because we can correct for protest with selection models and things like that, but also because it provides information on how respondents react to the survey. And people that protest are not only people that consider that the issue is no worth answering, or the fact that they are protesting against the fact that you try to give a value to ecosystem services, but it could be the fact that these are people that have a huge knowledge of the issue. And when you settle a framework to answer, you give information, they consider they have not enough information to answer. And they do not answer because they have no information, but because the information you provide is not enough for them. And they have a lot of questions based on what you present and which conflicts with what you have in mind, and they prefer to protest rather than answering. I think that Jürgen with colleagues have worked on this issue, the fact that protests are not necessarily people with a low level of knowledge that say, I don't care and do not answer, but also that some of the people have a lot of knowledge and prefer not answering instead of answering in the wrong direction or saying, I have not enough information to.
Yeah, I think for both suggesting the treatment of an attribution attendance model and the protest responses, the communication within the thesis could have been better about the. I haven't considered yet an ANA model, but it has been also suggested in my thesis committee. So that were some of the things on the list which I could still do, but I haven't done yet. So greetings go to Sophie Tollier. I don't know whether she's watching at the moment. Who gave me also the comment during the thesis committees, and I think these ANA models are very realistic. I think that because when I saw the participants taking their choices, they were focused on several attributes, each one on different ones. But I also wanted to comment on them that everything is important because it's their preferences, and therefore, of course, this attribute non-attendance model is something which could give further information, especially in combination of the framework you just mentioned for the values associated to this event, because in this case study in the Camargue that you mentioned, they not only provide information about the values associated to this landscape, they also divide the people into conformist and non-conformist people. And I think especially protest responses and these ANA models can be very different between conformist and non-conformist people. So already this combination of all these three parts, so the questions about the value at the beginning of the questionnaire, together with an ANA model and together with the exploration of the protest responses, would be very interesting. Because why I did not explore more the protest responses, because there were so few. I think at the end it was 9 protest responses, and they also protested, as you said, for different reasons. So we had, for example, one participant who left during the discussion because he was not happy with the way we organized the discussion. He thought he should have been more involved in the discussion, and therefore he left. There were other where they had these fatigue effects. So who really said, I cannot finish anymore. I'm tired. I cannot. I'm sorry. And there were others where the way they answered to our payment attributes indicated that would be protest responders, because they didn't want to trade off the other alternatives against the monetary payment. So which could be the reason for lexicographic preferences, for example. And therefore, they were not revealing their real willingness to pay. And I think, therefore, within the manuscript, I should have more mentioned information about the protest responses. I fully agree to this point. Because already the fact that we have less protest responses than in other studies is something which is quite interesting, which could be seen positively, because the setting allowed people to more express their preferences, and therefore they were less guided to protest. But on the other side, it could also be, as to include another remark within the report, that it could be the choice of our payment attribute, which was a donation to local associations. And as this kind of payment could also include a certain factor of warm glow, so that the payment is seen very positive for the persons, because they think it's for a good cause, because it's a donation, and therefore they have less interest to protest, but are also not really revealing their real willingness to pay, because the hypothetical bias is relatively strong in this case, because they think, well, it's only for local association, it's just an experiment, and they state higher player willingness to pay than they really have. So I think the exploration of protest responses, therefore, is something I haven't done enough because of their small number, but already the fact that there are a small number of protests is something which could be which should be investigated further in the thesis. So I thank you for this remark.
Okay, thank you. And finally, regarding the third chapter, part of it is going to rely on a qualitative approach, and using the transcription of the exchanges during the deliberative phase. And so in my report, I suggest two methods, similarity analysis and Alcest method that can be used and might be useful in comparing the ranking you will get from this method with the one you get from the HCA or HCA method. It would be interesting to have a purely quantitative approach, or two purely quantitative approaches and two qualitative approaches, and check on the aggregate, on the whole sample, and also at the individual level, whether the same people are in the same groups. And finally, I was also suggesting something one of my former colleagues, Juliette Rouchier, did, and who worked also with Yves on serious game, the use of serious game to help people understand complex procedures and for ecosystem services, which are complex goods in the economic sense, with a lot of potential conflict. It can be a way to make people enter this problematic and make their choice and help them before the DC. And my first question, a real question, and the last one is on the fact that you propose something which is quite new, but which is very costly in time and in the burden associated to the organization and buying the staff, organizing the meeting and so on. So it seems that the result is a tightening, if I summarize a lot, tightening the confidence interval for the deliberative group. So it provides some homogeneity in the answer, but maybe criticized by my colleague, for instance, or by everyone. And so overall, what is the trade-off between what you get in addition to standard method and the huge time and money you have to spend to have this result? So there is a positive outcome of what you propose, but then if there are a way to say, oh, it's worth doing that, or finally I can spend all this time and money to get larger samples, or to add a longer common procedure at the beginning and then exploit them. So that's my main question. The last one.
Good one.
It's difficult to answer, but
this is a little bit the cause of one of the phrases within the conclusion. So for the Savant groups, for example, we reached at the moment where people put all or reveal some of their values. So we are in a situation where all the values are on the table, which could perhaps limit the possibility to have some common agreement about how the landscape should evolve in the democratic process and discussion. And then we are taking, the valuation would like taking a picture of that and giving this picture to the decision makers as an information. And therefore, I think that in this case, deliberation is even more useful in order to have co-construction, because everything is on the table. You just have to construct based on these values, and you can come to an agreement. And therefore, have evaluation at this point could be something which is still useful, but as you mentioned, given all the investment and the difficulties to get to this point, get one step further, I think would be a good option. How should deliberation be used further? For example, for the Montpellier groups, I think as it reaches to have very complementary representations of values within the participants, so that all these values are included in the preferences, the value which comes out of such evaluation has a huge benefit compared to values from standard from standard approaches. And should, at this case, the value be taken by traditional methods or not? I think this depends on the degree of what type of values are included in the issue we want to value. So if there's a high degree of non-material ecosystem services, I think it would be a better option to have deliberative valuation. But if there are more tangible benefits, I think there's no need in having this lasting discussions if the value we find at the end has not a big complementarity to what we could have found with traditional methods. So I think it depends on the degree of how transcendental values and deeper held values affect the behavior of the people when they are asked to take a decision or to choose on a certain option what they want to have happen at their local scale. The second thing is, in this thesis, I'm more concerned about the local scale. So what should we do in a local context? If we really want to go further and have, for some ecosystem services, some global values, I think it is perhaps not only necessary, but it should be that there's deliberation in play, because otherwise the democratic base, even which you can even do on huge sample sizes, because on a global scale, I think you need huge sample sizes, their deliberation should still be applied, because otherwise the representativeness of the preferences and accounting for different perspectives is not included in this valuation. So having some value which goes beyond the local context should be made with deliberation. And also on deliberation by very different types of person. If for finding a value which goes beyond the local scale, you have just very homogeneous people from within this context. There's not much complementarity within the value, which can represent also values which are beyond this context. So therefore, I think deliberation shouldn't be done in every context. It should be only done when there are many transcendental and deeper held values at play, when it's willing to set the beginning of a co-construction, and if the value, which is the result of the valuation, should be representative for several regards. So this for me are three important criteria when the effort to make deliberations is efficient.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, and this can be decided at during the pilot phase, or whether or not during the pilot you find that in fact there are a lot of tangible, mostly tangible things that for which there are consensus. Then you say it's a deliberative phase. Would not be useful
to justify that we had a okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So overall,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your work. It's very interesting in going in the transdisciplinary process, and what you propose is very interesting. I'm curious of what you will get from the qualitative analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now it's time to give the floor to Yves Ménard. Okay, for the video.
Yes, thanks a lot, Mr. President. Thanks a lot, Marcus. Congratulations for all this work. Congratulations for the quality of your talk, which was very clear. For the quality of the manuscript, which was a very interesting read. And well, for the quality of the work, and I want to stress especially all the attention that you devoted to the preparation of your field work. This was very impressive. So again, congratulations. Still, I have a series of points that I want to raise. So if it's okay for you, I will mention them by sort of blocks, and then you will reply to each block. So I will start with details, and then the points will be of increasing importance. So I'm sorry to start with that kind of detail, but Olivier mentioned the fact that the bibliography, the choice of the format for the bibliography was not reader friendly. So I agree, but I also wanted to say that there are inconsistencies in the way you have built your bibliography. For example, if you take page 21 in the manuscript that I have, you have reference to Lamb Conway, which is not in the same format and which is not in the bibliography. And there are several other small problems like that. So these are details, but well, it's part of the work. Another detail, in a sense, is that you devote many pages to explanation of the basics of some techniques in econometric techniques and statistical tools that look like chapters in textbooks, and I think this was unnecessary in your manuscript. It's not that useful, and it takes many pages. So, but on the other hand, there are important informations that are lacking, or perhaps they are hidden somewhere, and I was unable to identify them. For example, well, the description of what happened during the meetings is not very detailed. For example, who was the meeting leader? Who took the floor when, for how long? So this, I know that you know that it's important because you mentioned all these points in the review of best practices. So there is a contrast between this mention of the importance of these details and the lack of a detailed description of what happened. So that was the first block. If you have something to add, perhaps on the last point, why you did not give more detailed explanation. I know it's time consuming, but perhaps just that, but well, it's important.
I fully agree to your remark regarding the report of what really happened with the deliberation. I thought of having this information also to be given with the transcripts, because it's more where there when it really counts how participants declared what they are thinking, that the way we organized or we had our discussion taking place is interfering. Nevertheless, well, now when you mention it, well, for me it's very clear that, yeah, of course there should have been more mentions about that, how we did it, who was our professional moderator during the discussions, and so how we organized the discussions within. So for example, as I said, we had the example of one participant who left during the discussion because he didn't felt sufficiently accounted for. It was also, for example, a good remark because it was the only group where we had 15 people. So it was quite hard to manage the discussion, that everybody comes into, could participate. And I think, as you said, that has a huge influence. And I further wanted to show this also with the data we had at the end, because we also had a questionnaire about how the participants felt during the discussion. And that is still some data which is important to see, I think, and to further analyze. So therefore, I'm fully agree to this point you mentioned. Regarding my relatively long explanations about the different techniques, I made that because at the moment where I started to look up the different things, there are many different textbooks, but who are only taking one part or one dimension of this discrete choice experiment. So either how to organize, either how the econometrics is, how is the dynamic during group discussions. And I haven't found a reference who summarizes all that. So I really wanted to, and I wanted to have this second chapter as its main value for the thesis and for research itself, furnishing this summary of the literature. And as I think this is important, I'm very glad that now the literature exists. So Jürgen, with other authors, has now published such a textbook for everything which is about DC discrete choice experiments. So even if it means that in any case, the second chapter wasn't a big novelty, but I think it was an important summary of the literature that existed and the best practices that existed. And therefore, I think for the reader, if you know the other literature is nothing new, but I wanted to have it for other researchers who wanted to perhaps study in the same direction, to have also something which summarizes the state of the art of the moment.
Okay. So thanks. My next question is, as far as I understand, your presentation of the 7 context is based mainly, or perhaps uniquely, on the Charter of the Park, or is the name of this document? So
Mainly, yes.
It seems a bit too narrow. Perhaps it's a biased source. I mean, this is just one point of view. Perhaps it was constructed through a participatory approach, but perhaps there were problems with this participatory approach. Perhaps there are arbitrary choices that were made in the presentation. So I think you should have taken a broader basis to make this this analysis of the context, even if it's not the central point. If you in your work, still it's of importance.
Yeah, I think in my impression, the literature from the national park was quite diverse. But as you said, perhaps there are some biases within, and I'm not capable to judge these biases. But what still fosters, I think that it's a good document, is that within our discussions, we nearly never had positions which I haven't found before in the national parks.
You talk about the focus group, during the focus group?
No, even in the deliberative groups, there were seldom things that were said that were at least not mentioned. Perhaps the national park is positioned differently on that. But at least the discussion about this issue mainly was concerned within their document. And perhaps, and I should say, although we never have mentioned to have something in common with the national park. So on our posters, on all our communication, we paid attention to not have notified the national park somewhere, because also we didn't collaborate with the national park. We just took the information they published, because we know that there's several opposition within this event with the national park. And so having some posters with the emblem of the national park could have made some arbitrary situations or some arbitrary decisions from the national park directly contested by the participants in our workshop. And this didn't happen. So I have the impression that the information was quite useful. I could have included several other sources. I also read some other articles, but which have been quite similar to what was in the document of the national park. So especially, for example, discussions with Yves Lapart. C'est Yves Lapart?
No, Jacques.
Jacques, no. I'm sorry. So, and also with some, the other member was, I think, of the national park. That's true. So I think that it's a point, but I don't think that it would have a good a big influence on the results.
Perhaps you should have explained that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so my next point refers to your work with the focus group. So again, congratulations for that, because you did a lot of work with focus group, and you used the information and everything that came from the focus group to structure your work. But this raises the question, which is, what is your logic to decide when your technical or scientific expertise starts and the relevance of what people in the focus group say ends? And this question emerges in particular with the issue of the payment vehicle, because you explicitly say that you don't really agree with their opinion, but still you decided to follow the advice of the focus group, not your own expertise. So what is your logic to decide if there are several cases, and I get there were several cases where you had to make the choice? What is the logic?
For me, the logic was I wanted to guarantee that this study or the experiment will take place in a good favor, and so in a good way, so that we won't have some difficulties which about which the focus groups had told us before. So when there was a doubt, I tried to follow the focus groups, because I'm perhaps an expert. I'm not an expert, but I had literature about what happens in the national park. But as you said, there can be some very different perceptions about that, and therefore, in the doubt, I wanted to trust the focus groups, because they could inform us about things that could go wrong in the deliberative groups.
Okay.
And I think there was also something very positive about that in the deliberative groups, because as I have been seen as a scientist or an expert, several people wanted a little bit to challenge the information I gave. So, for example, they saw the presentation and they immediately thought, yeah, but as a scientist, he looks at this point very differently in a very narrow way. And they expressed this view within the discussion, which I personally found very positive, because this means that for all the other participants within the discussion, there's another complementary view. Even if the motivation behind is to challenge me as a scientist, I think for the discussion, it was a very positive thing.
Okay, thanks. So now let's come to points that are more important. First, I'd like to hear more about the top-down versus bottom-up dichotomy and its link with deliberative evaluation. Well, I get the point that in a sense, in a participative or deliberative approach, because people participate, it's sort of bottom-up, and because we have at the end some things that can feed a cost-benefit analysis or stuff like that, you have a top-down dimension. Okay, but there is more to the dichotomy, the top-down versus bottom-up dichotomy in policy design and policy implementation. I mean, important in this dichotomy is also the idea that in policy design and implementation, there are different levels of not only people, but also institutions with different roles, and the interactions between the various levels is an important aspect of the complexity of the bottom-up structure. And if you reduce the bottom-up approach to the idea that just people should participate, and if you reduce the top-down dimension to the idea that we have at some point one decision that that is about the whole system. It seems to me that you reduce the dichotomy to I mean a very somewhat trivial idea. So it's published in the paper like that, but I think it needs more explanation, nuances, and perhaps recognition that it is just a small part of the bottom-up versus top-down complexities.
I think what is true is that there are for top-down and bottom-up, there are several side approaches which can be quite different to the main approach. So, for example, for top-down implementation, I think something which is very important is this issue of framing. So if you are in a top-down setting, not only you want the lower levels to have the decision to be implemented, you also have the power to change the institutional setting around these lower levels of administration, for example. And this changes quite drastically the way you can inform the decision maker. Because if you are having a huge protocol with many stakeholders integrated, which really helps for bottom-up, because bottom-up, as you said, is much more than only having participants, it's also stakeholders, because often the things are implemented with the help of stakeholders. So having integrated stakeholders, which is often the case for deliberative approaches, really helps in this implementation. On the other side, if you have this kind of protocol for a top-down implementation, you just risk that by the power of the decision maker, it doesn't account for the willingness of some stakeholders to implement the decision or not. And therefore, it's not said that all the information you included in the evaluation in your protocol is really needed or taken into account at this high level of the decision making. And this brings us to this conclusion that if you risk to have a huge protocol, but at the final it's only the small value which you find, which is communicated, which is taken into account by the decision maker, then it's traditional monetary evaluation, which you should do, because everything you're doing elsewhere risks to not to be taken into account because of these framing effects. And these framing effects make that you have also very different implementation context, even in top-down implementation. And as you said, in bottom-up, you have different responsibilities, even on a local scale, between practitioners. You have different sorts of stakeholders, so therefore having a standard deliberative approach which fits this bottom-up implementation is largely simplistic. And it's the diversity of deliberative and participative approaches which makes this kind of studies valuable in bottom-up implementation.
Okay.
Please,
So,
we have a material contingency, so if you can short question and short answer, please.
okay. So, this is my last question.
Thank you.
Well, your manuscript is divided in two parts. One is called theoretical, the other one empirical. This conveys the idea that the first part is only about theory, and the second part is only about empirics. And this conveys another idea, which is that the first part contained a theoretical contribution, which is used then in the second part to structure the empirical approach. Okay, so in my view, these two ideas that are conveyed by the structure are a little bit deceptive. On the one hand, there is more than theory in the first part. There is a lot of there are many results from the literature that are not strictly speaking theoretical. There are some ideas that are theoretical. On the other hand, in the various chapters in the second part, there are theoretical elements, many theoretical elements. But the most worrying thing is that I found myself unable to identify the role that the theoretical ideas in the first part structure the work you did in the empirical part. And the most important aspect of this problem, in my view, is the role of science policy interfaces. You talk a lot about them in the first part. You say it's very important, and in my view, it's part of your theoretical contribution to stress the importance of them. But I don't understand where are SPI in the empirical part. I found myself unable to identify them. So could you clarify this aspect?
I think I already tried to more capture this within the presentation. So there I several times made the link between why we wanted to have ecosystem service bundles as an indicator, because it's in transdisciplinary process, and therefore we have different disciplines which can talk about the same issue, which retakes this notion of SPIs. I think the main concern for me was less about how the structure impacts the way you the reader expect the thesis to be developed, but more in which order I present the different things I made, because finally I made a literature review and I made this study, and of course there were impacts from both to each other. And my main concern was, how can I present what we did in this event with the theoretical elements I had in mind? So therefore I put all these into the second chapter, and all the results which were a result of that, but also what my thoughts of the first chapter afterwards, so that the reader knows where the results come from within the study we made. And for me, this was, perhaps I should have made just a contribution without theoretical and empirical part and just by chapters. But I wanted to make clear that after the second chapter, which would have been all my preparation in the Cevennes and what the Cevennes study was about, would have stopped afterwards for the other chapters. So for me, the important thing was a clear distinction. Now in this, everything about the Cevennes, but also about the knowledge I gained in the first chapter. But it's mainly concerned with the Cevennes, and the other part is not concerned with the Cevennes. And I see your concern about how this can influence the way the reader attends the manuscript to develop.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marcus.
Thank you.
Thanks. So you now it's your way of address some comments to your marks. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much also to you, Marcus, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to read your thesis. I have to admit that I'm a bit skeptical on this deliberation approach, so it was very exciting for me to get into this a bit deeper and have to think about a bit more deeply and carefully. And what I really like in your work is the empirical effort you did, not only the pilot and focus groups, but also to have these treatment groups. I mean, and think that's something, at least I can't remember a study where they have done it that carefully, to have these deliberative groups and treatment groups where they have no deliberation. And I think this comparison is needed in the literature, so that I would also suggest that this is, if you have time afterwards. I mean, I just yesterday was told that you leave in a week, and don't know whether you have time to proceed with analyzing these data and publishing, but I think it could be an interesting contribution to the literature to publish, especially this part, because not many people, or maybe nobody, has done such a lot of effort on comparing these two approaches. But now my question starts, and I guess I have to work a bit for my flight ticket. So the first thing would be, when I was going through your comparison and of the treatment groups and the deliberative groups, where you then use coefficients or WTPs. And I was thinking, I mean, wouldn't it be much easier and robust in this small sample environment you are working in, to just do cross tables for those who have done choices and compare the treatment groups and the attribute levels, for example, and to simply see whether this is a distribution that varies significantly or is the same across these. And I think this would be a much more robust method instead of working with a mixed logit model. So that would be something maybe to think about when you publish, and to go a step back from the modeling and just let the data speak a bit more, which is something I think often people forget, and too quickly go to complex models, and instead of just taking the data as they are and try to get a story from the data and see what could be done with this on the more basic level.
So just to understand it right, just for example, comparing the proportion of answers having given to a certain number of attributes between the both samples. So for example, one sample has more, or the deliberative group wanted to have more, for example, conserved landscapes, whereas the other wanted perhaps less this conservation of the pastures. Okay.
Well, you can do it for each attribute separately, and then you see whether the deliberation leads to a different, that a different level of your attribute is chosen more often, more frequently. So that would be very simple indication of different preferences. The other thing related to this, and this comes a bit back to what Olivier has already said, is this the modeling approach. And I was a bit surprised. I mean, you carefully published the engine code, and when you look at the code, you can see that you already prepared your design for a random parameter logit model. And so my question was, or is, given that you know that you're working in this small sample environment, and the RPL is rather a model that requires a lot of data, why did you already do this decision at a very early stage to move into that direction?
I think it was because I attended that there's huge heterogeneity within the perception, and therefore I already planned to, or I saw it as a very important thing to have a random parameter model. And as you said, as it requires to have huge sample sizes, I wanted the design to be already efficient for this random parameter.
Can we have a look at one of your regressions, or with a mixed logit model? Maybe if it takes too much time, it's not necessary. But my point
for the outputs.
Yeah. Then. I think a reason why this might not have been such a good decision when you look at the RPL output is you have, for I think it was forest cover in some of the models where the mean isn't significant, but you have a highly significant standard deviation, which has also a huge value compared to the mean value. And my understanding, I mean, I always say I wasn't born as an econometrician, but what I understand is that this is an indication that there are rather different groups of people, because I mean they can't agree on or the model cannot find the mean as an agreement on their preferences, and so it might collapse to 2 or 3 groups. And so I would be very much in favor of using a latent class in detail, because the first thing is it's not, I would say, that hungry for observations. You do have to do less assumptions when it comes to distribution of your parameters, and it might capture better given the results you do have. What is the basic structure? And so a question here would be, because I was a bit surprised when you were saying that the nested logit might be a way to combine what you have. And well, to some extent, it's a step back, or I mean, from capturing unobserved heterogeneity. So I would recommend to think about this latent class and somehow have a post-analysis with your cluster. I mean, whether certain clusters are more represented in another class compared to another class.
Okay. So to have this, okay, so comparing the bundles with the latent, so as suggested by Olivier. Just get further yeah.
It's very hard to find. It will be very hard to find for class with such a small size sample. Because
the RPL is more data hungry than the latent class, I would say. So if you dare to use an RPL in that environment, I mean, it shouldn't be a problem with the latent class, especially as you can go for a small number of classes. I mean, just what I always seen is that going from 1 to 2 classes captures already substantial heterogeneity, and it might allow you to interpret your results even better. So,
yeah. So I think in any case, the mixed logit, although it's called the final model, in any case, for me is an intermediary step to further develop. And I first had the idea to a nested logit because I really wanted to include these bundles. So saying that people having the same perception of the bundles are also very probable to have correlated preferences about the alternatives, and therefore that the belonging to a certain cluster is a good criterion for belonging to a certain nest, and therefore guarding this ecosystem service bundle structure. But as you said, and as Olivier said, and therefore very curious about looking what latent class can improve in this data.
Another question regarding your bundling. I mean, I'm not completely sure whether I understood this bundling correctly, but wouldn't it be an alternative to simply use more attributes? To debundle, or in a sense of saying, okay, if I have so many aspects, I might just increase the number of attributes. Would you say that could be an alternative? Or
I think the question is to which degree. So because if we are having nearly 20 different indicator statements, the question is whether some should be aggregated in order to belong to one attribute and others should be stand within themselves. So which number of attributes would finally occur? So I really wanted to have a maximum number of, at maximum 6 attributes. And therefore, I think with all the different things included within the attribute, I would have found it difficult to have more attributes. And I also see that some ecosystem services, for example, were present in several attributes. So especially the static value, you can attribute this to the landscape, whether it is forested or not, or whether forests themselves are more aesthetic because they are more broadleaf forests, or whether it's a coniferous forest. So my goal was indeed to have a method that tries to include all these complexity of what landscape, because landscapes are complex, and to insert them into not as many attributes so that a choice is still feasible. And so to combine complexity by having a large amount of indicator statements and simplicity thanks to just having a limited number of attributes in the choice. So I think that it would be an alternative, but the question is whether it would also have notably some attribute non-attendance as a consequence, or fatigue effects when you have several choice cards.
I mean, something to look at might be that I think it's published in Forest Policy and Economics, a paper by Japanese people, Kim et al. Something. They did a partial profile design where you don't present all attributes to all respondents, but on some choice sets they don't vary some attributes so that they are not relevant for the choices. And what they do is, I mean, they have, I think in the end, 15 attributes, and due to this partial profile design, on each choice set only 5 attributes are relevant, so that this allows them, I mean, maybe not in this small observation sample size environment, but it could be a way to, well, get more information out of people's choices and don't have to go this bundling way, which has or could also have an influence on results. So that, at least for the future, might be interesting to think about this.
In forest policy?
Yeah, I think it's Forest Policy and Economics. I can send you the reference. The question concerning the deliberative workshop. I mean, when you think about the big problems we have in the discussion about validity, reliability of results of stated preference surveys, mainly deriving from the hypothetical bias, would you say that after the deliberation workshops, this gap is closer, that people are closer to what they would really do afterwards? So that deliberation is a method also to have an answer to the problems of stated preferences?
I think so, and notably, I think there are some answers which could be an indicator for that. So here there are some graphs about how the deliberation impacted certain ways that participants perceive the questionnaire. And so, for example, here in this graph with the green bars, we have that in both NS7 and in Montpellier, it reduced the proportion of people who gave well, just random answers. So saying that, yeah, because it's hypothetical, I would just choose one. No, they took more effort because they were deliberated. And I think they also, in the mind of the people, I had the impression that the fact that we gave them the possibility to discuss, they also were more disposed to really think about the things and take it seriously. I also think that some did not. So sometimes I heard also some participants, yeah, you can, in any case, you can state anything because it's just hypothetical. So I think it still exists. But I think that deliberation is a good measure in order to reduce this hypothetical bias, because people are happy that they feel that they can participate, and therefore they are taking more effort. And perhaps it's a positive thing of a courtesy bias. So thinking that because they took the effort, I also take the effort to state my preferences seriously. But in fact, I haven't much data about that. So that could be in future projects something which could be tested.
Yeah, but also something I would suggest to include in a publication on this comparison of these two. I mean, I think we already discussed this, but this question about this deliberation, I mean, if it really shows that there is a difference and the quality, however defined, increases, wouldn't this in the end mean that we have to go with all people through deliberative valuation workshops? And isn't it, I mean, the idea to some extent from this economic evaluation could also be to get a quick or rough estimate of what people's preferences are, to aggregate them. I mean, if you just think about larger spatial context, regional, national, or, I mean, for the local, probably this is something, but I guess then you don't really need economic valuation. You can just go for other types of participation and decision making. But if it comes to this, we have to decide on rather broad study, and you want to know building new highways and have to incorporate non-market values about nature protection, for example. So then, and that's a bit what Olivier was already saying, this is a huge effort to go through this. And does it serve, or is this always necessary? Because the rough estimate might not be that much different.
I think there's also a nice paper by Nele Lienhoop and Bartosz Bartkowski, where they are saying they are separating different valuation approaches regarding their purpose. So, for example, if the purpose is to have a value for something, for a fine for a company, for example, who polluted, their deliberation can be very helpful because it's a very local context, and you need to have a representative value for in this specific design. Sometimes for deliberative valuation, I have the image in my head of a Nash equilibrium. So what you have, so the advantage of deliberation is that it can be applied to a very local context, and it gives you a value of something. But the value, you very often want to have it that you can attend it or transfer it into to another context. And there, effectively, deliberation, as it is quite context dependent, doesn't help. And so, for example, if you want to transfer value to another context, you need to have huge deliberations at several stages. So then perhaps traditional, just as one part of the decision-making, traditional approaches would have been better. And given that you're in a local context, perhaps having a valuation or a deliberation is what I said, then you can even go one step further. So if you have already taken all this effort, why you still have to make a value out of it if you can already include this into decision making, such as deliberative polling, for example, or citizen juries. So I think there are always if there's really a need to have a value, then deliberation can help if it's need to be representative and if you really need to have a value. And if you really have to take it that the value takes into attention different contexts, then deliberation can be an alternative, but it has to really be diversified and has to include many people. Otherwise, I think traditional valuation approaches are more helpful because they are not as difficult to achieve as deliberative valuation.
Okay, so just two quick things. One thing is, have you ever thought about presenting the results afterwards again in a, well, I would say post-survey groups, in the sense of how do people, after you've analyzed the results, and go back to the people and say, so this is what I've been doing with your responses. What do you think about this?
I have thought of that already, but I don't know whether we can implement it. And also because the other idea was, as there were several decision makers included in just giving us the rooms, or just also giving a survey for them, how do our results help them in order to design several projects or or to make decisions based on our results. So how the results could have presented differently and would have been more useful for them. So especially regarding my first chapter about implementation, this is something I thought of, and I'm quite skeptical whether we still can do that. I think we will still send the results, and perhaps then we can have some follow-up questionnaires with the participants. But seriously, that's something which I had in mind, but I'm skeptical whether we are able to do that.
For my last one, it's a bit reflection in the sense of, I mean, assume that after your PhD thesis, you will proceed as a researcher and get your next project, and money is not really a problem. What would you say is the biggest mistake you definitely don't want to repeat in the new project when you think about your work of the last years? Where you say, okay, Marcus, well, this was really something where I said, no, don't do it again. I mean, just
I think it's
in the sense of learning from mistakes.
Yeah, I think it's already something Yves said. It's in trusting the focus groups. So in some focus groups, we remarked that we had serious difficulties in organizing the workshops. And we thought that, well, having experience and if we have some other communication measures, I think this will be better, but it wasn't that much better. We took huge effort in order to have our deliberative workshops. And therefore, I think there I should more trust my focus groups. I think this is, for me, this is a takeaway message from where a really careful design of discrete choice experiment is really helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
So, Raphaël.
Yes.
Raphaël Preget.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Michel and Marcus, for your invitation and for giving me the opportunity to read this thesis and to have the opportunity to discuss it today. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. So thank you for the invitation. Of course, I fully associate myself with all the congratulations that have been expressed before me. I am really impressed by all the work you have done in your thesis. When I look at the bibliographies, there are many references in pluridisciplinary, and it's quite impressive for me. Also, of course, because all the organized workshop you did with Mika also, and to have this discussion with so many people. And of course, I'm also impressed by the numerous analysis you conducted with different methods in your thesis. So congratulations for all this and for your publication also in the Ecological Economics of your first chapter. Well, the congratulations also for the document, which is quite impressive, and I just want to mention that it is writing very small, well, for me, because it was not so easy to read, and even some figures and tables, I couldn't really see what was written, so it's a pity to work so hard and then not be able to look at the results, but otherwise, and there are also maybe many acronyms, and it would be nice to have maybe an index of the acronyms in the thesis. Well, I would like to point out that I'm not a specialist in ecosystem services evaluation at all, and neither in deliberation approach, so my comments will be more on the discrete choice part. But I've learned a lot also, because I'm not a specialist of ecosystem service evaluation, so it's interesting to read your work. So many things have been already said about even the discrete choice experiment part. I have some few points, maybe I can come back. Well, maybe just first question about the relation between your questionnaire you present in your appendix and your protocol, the experimental protocol, because I did not really know, well, understand what was what you call, for example, basic information at the beginning, that you is it just the first page of the questionnaire where you say Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour, etc., and with maybe the two first questions, preliminary questions, or is it more than that? And what is also, and when you say, well, just in the control group, you go directly to the main questionnaires, the choice cards, so you present the 9 choice cards without explaining the attributes. Well, I don't know. So I don't know if the questionnaire presented it. Which one? The control or the treatment?
I think I have just
like, yes, because here you have a party 1 introduction, but I don't know if it's, well, I couldn't find where you present the attributes of the first experiment. So
we first had this first questions, as Olivier had also already said, where we ask people about the values they attach to preferences. Afterwards, we have this, as you said, this introduction. So this means that the participants had this information is within their questionnaires. They not yet had the discrete choice experiment. And we made a presentation about all the services included and which are presented. So they could follow our presentation with the help of this introductory document. Then either followed directly the discussion. So we just took, now we want to discuss about the landscapes, or we said, now we want to have your opinion about the landscapes, and therefore we are using a discrete choice experiment. And then we explained how a discrete choice experiment works. So this means that the basic information was basic information about the landscape in the savanna, in order to have some baseline for everybody. Then the discussion means really directly discussion, and main questionnaire included the explanations about the discrete choice experiment. So how a choice card works, and
okay, so this is not presented in the appendix.
No.
Okay, I understand.
So because this was also done orally by So it wasn't part of the questionnaire, but part of the presentation, which we did to the participants.
And the questionnaire, well, the choice card was presented on papers,
yeah.
And so they could come back on the different choice cards. And
we said them to not to do so, because we said, yeah, it's not that, yeah, we directly said that you cannot only choose just one alternatives among all the different ones, but you have to choose really per paper. It didn't every time work, and I also don't want it to notice people that they did differently, because otherwise they would have felt being observed, and therefore also that could have created some problems. This is also the case, for example, in some questionnaires we hadn't the answer to all choice cards. I think sometimes it's just because they turned 2 pages, and therefore 2 choice cards are included. I also there I saw it, and I was afraid of either telling them, because otherwise, well, they would have felt observed, and they could have an impact on how they do their choices. And there I preferred not to say something, but just to say at the end, okay, please verify that you really have the answer to all choice cards. But yeah.
This explains why you don't have a multiple of 9 in your observations.
Exactly.
And, okay, because it was it was weird to me. I couldn't understand how many respondents are in each sample. And you don't really explain, in fact, well, what are your samples? Because you talk about protest answers, for example, but you don't say what you do with this protest answers. If you move them or not, how many are there? And if they have the same rate of protest in the 4 treatments, because it's, well, it might be important. Well, you said that there's only 9 protest respondents, so it's not so many. Well, maybe there's another point that I was, well, I would like to discuss with you, because you distinguish 2 populations, the Cevennes and Montpellier, but to me, the reason for doing so are not so clear, because you ask respondents in the questionnaire if they live or used to live in Montpellier or in the Cevennes for 5 years, or, and don't you think that there might be not much difference between a respondent who from Montpellier who has lived for more than 5 years in the 7, and another respondent in the seventh sample, but who just arrived in the 7, and if he doesn't come from Montpellier but from somewhere else, so you don't. Well, I don't know if there are many. You don't present any statistics about those variables, and
the reason for that is that during our focus groups there was an apparent difference that between people which have been in this event for a long time, and for those who just arrived, and therefore we wanted to account for this difference within our data, and just to have parallelly the same data in Montpellier. So for persons who just arrived in Montpellier, and for those who know the event perhaps a little bit more than others. So the initial motivation was to have this question only in the event, to have this difference between people living there for a long time and others. In our discussions, for example, those who have arrived not this long time ago, they claimed that they had difficulties to install themselves, because people which are already living there don't want to sell some of their houses or some of their parcels to people coming from outside. And we wanted to control for this effect, but in the end, this effect is not is not significant at all, which also surprised us. So there's not a big difference in the perception of the landscape from people just arriving and people living there for a long time.
Well, so yes, as Tina, I was surprised that you do not separate treatments and control instead of the sample at the beginning, and run an estimation on this difference. And you seem very concerned about having a representative sample of your two populations, but I don't think you checked that your respondents are well distributed across the two treatments. Well, I don't know. Well, but I mean, did you check that the two treatments are well balanced with respect to various potential important variables?
And we, as we've used a little bit a mix from random and stratified sampling, we ensured that over the whole population, it's representative. And we were a little bit limited in having the same criteria applying to the subgroups, because if, for example, you know that so the quantities of treatment and control groups is well equilibrated. But if, for example, you know that the last workshop needs to be a control group, and then you have more or less elderly people who inscribe, you're a little bit trumped. So, and therefore, I think we should still further communicate on this issue. But I can already indicate that it's not as representative as, I think it's not as good as for the whole population, because as within one deliberative workshop, you're already fixed on what treatment you have. So you cannot compensate certain differences in the samples, because as you have already started the deliberative workshop, and apparently there's some sorts of people which are missing for the treatment group or for the control group, you can't adapt anymore. So therefore, that could have made problems. Nevertheless, I don't think that there's a big difference. So there could be some differences. It would be surprising if there were. So we'll have to check that.
I like the discussions you have about the monetary attributes. Indeed, I guess it's not an easy task to define such attribute here, but well, I run discrete choice experiment, but always to estimate the willingness to accept for farmers or changing their, but here it's different, and And well, maybe I think, well, the donation to association is probably a pertinent choice. I don't have any other proposition, but still, donations are compulsory here. And so it's kind of, well, strange. And do you really, I don't really understand what this monetary attribute means in terms of willingness to pay for proposed alternative. So it's an hypothetical scenario, but if this would be implemented for real, who would have to make this compulsory donation? Well, all the inhabitants of the Seven, and even Montpellier tourists, or and every year only once. So it was not really clear for me. This.
So as we presented it, that there would have been a payment for the Cevennes population and the payment for the Montpellier population, but this payment could have been differently as we presented it. Of course, that which is still hypothetical, and I think the first point you mentioned about how we presented it as a measure of willingness to pay. We presented it as if in previous discussions there was some kind of not misunderstanding, but mistrust in regard of having some experts or some decision maker applying the project. So if you want to have a certain alternative to be made real, there has to be a decision maker who decides on that. And people didn't want to have local decision makers to have that, but to have the associations, because they are really engaged within their willingness to change something, and therefore they had much more trust into this institution of local associations, and therefore I think we are less protesting against this payment vehicle, which apparently, as I think, as I noted in the manuscript, was a quite lucky choice, because we had the movement of the Gilets jaunes just afterwards. So if we had taken something like taxes or something, we would have huge protest responses, and therefore this is again the point why the choice of the payment attribute is not neutral on the results. So I'm fully agreeing to that.
Well, these points relate to the willingness to pay, the results you obtain. Well, I agree with this is Olivier, and you do not really explain how you compute those willingness to pay. Since you have a random monetary attribute, it's not so easy. And you do not present also the confidence interval for this willingness to pay. I think you should add that information. But your research, I'm surprised by the quite high level of those willingness to pay. Well, maybe it's usual in when you evaluate ecosystem services, but this is like a public good, and that there are such a high level, I guess. Well, in the choice cards, the highest level was 75 euros, but in the scenarios that you see made, quite high. I don't know how much, but many hundreds of euros. So I was surprised by this, this high levels.
I think the high willingness to pay are also part of the monetary attribute we chose. So I think having donation to a local association as a payment is inflating the willingness to pay, because there's a huge or the several impact of a warm glow effect. So you're not giving to the project, but you're giving to an association, and that changes the way you perceive this attribute and could or increase your willingness to pay officially. The second point you mentioned was, I have already forgotten, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Well, just maybe one last point about the interaction variables that you add in your nonlinear models. You said in the last chapter that you cannot really interpret those, but still you use it in your in your estimation. So I don't really understand why you use those in the last chapter. Why don't you use only the main attributes model, a simple model to compare both the treatment and the control groups? Since you acknowledge that it's not.
So as it's in many approaches, it's still done to interpret these interaction terms. I just wanted to look whether it's similar to the other results we had. So whether this can just give another sort of, well, perhaps also by the not very robust method of these interaction terms, there's they suggest the same findings, perhaps that it's just fostering a little bit the results, although I'm still relying only on the methods without the interaction terms. And I think I haven't used them for calculation of the willingness to pay, because there I paid attention to, because this would have been, so for me, for the willingness to pay, I think I didn't use them for within the nonlinear models, I think.
I don't know what really say.
Yeah, I didn't use the interaction on deliberation, as I stated in the 4th chapter, but I used some interactions for the calculation of willingness to pay, just in order to show how following these interaction terms, different sociodemographics could change the willingness to pay. So there's a certain heterogeneity in the preferences of the population. So, and just in order to show that, I use them for that's true. Yes.
Okay, so I think beyond all this remark, I would like to congratulate again Marcus for the work done, and maybe, well, Jean-Michel will probably say it, but as a member of the same and working every day in the same building as Marcus and in the Bâtiment 26, I would like to testify that about Marcus' exceptional kindness and his great involvement in the life of our collective. So it's really a really nice person, and who everybody appreciates. So I'm really happy to be here today for the defense. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. So it's I have to give you my my comments about your work, Marcus. First, I would like to say that I share a lot of, or most of the comments and remarks that were addressed by my colleagues. And I would like first to congratulate for the documents. First, I would like to come on the slide with the graph, control group, and so I'm very impressed by the amount of works you have to achieve to provide this document today and to defend this PhD thesis. But these figures, this graph, this picture arrived early in your reflection, you think of it, and you present this in your internal workshop and inside the same seminar, and I was very impressed by the fact that I said in my mind, oh, it's a brave PhD candidates, because it's very ambitious. So, and 3, 4, 5 years later, I'm very happy to see that you reach and you done a good job on this with the Yellow Jacket movement, with COVID-19 pandemic crisis, with a lot of events. And so I would like to congratulate for this job, for this job, sorry, because
Thank you.
just one remark or question about your work is about, do you think that in the focus group you can use other method? You can use best worth scaling as alternative to have some other information about the bundles of ecosystem services. Do you know what is best worth scaling strategy?
That they, instead of choosing between already calibrated alternatives, they ask to design their own best alternative.
The best, and so it's not alternative, it's just a level of attributes. And you can submit the respondents of the focus group, not on the pilot, on the at the end of the processes and on the DCE, but you can use best worth scaling to select a bundle of ecosystem services. And members of focus group can have to rank the best level of attributes. There is no attributes in the focus group, and it's a list of characteristics of ecosystem services, of other attributes or other characteristics, the best and the worst. And each respondent has to do this task 5 or 6 times. Okay. And I think it's in line with the comment of Jürgen about some studies that present not all attributes and not all levels of attributes. We can show in the literature review that this kind of best worth scaling is less cognitive demand or needs less cognitive effort to the respondents. So I think it would be an alternative in the preliminary step of the study, notably in the focus groups.
I think this is true, and I can also add to that even within our groups, within our discussions, we had participants who said, I don't see the sense within your choice cards. I would like just to have that I choose the best alternative. So for me, that would be much easier, and I think it would be enough information for you. So I think from the participants' side, this is, as I said, for the cognitive burden, it's better solution, and therefore have it in the focus groups in order to derive information. This is positive. I think it could be a good method, because in our focus groups we didn't have the choice experiment yet. We just had questions about the different attributes we wanted to have, and so complement this with this best and worst alternative statements. I think could have helped, and have also this within the pilot test.
Thank you. So it's the other comments are yet addressed by my colleagues. So as Raphael said that you are in the real life situation, great colleagues, I would like to testify that you have some, you have to give some lecture and some tutorial at the Department of Economics, and students and colleagues are very happy that you can give this lecture and this lecture and tutorial, because we have a great and didactic and pedagogic qualities.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for all of this. So I give you now, if you want to, if there is no answer, it's just congratulations. So I give the floor to your supervisor, Jean-Michel Salle.
Thank you, Mr. President. You can tell that I have to take this position to be online with the camera. Oh no, it's
You want to change?
no, it's okay. Don't worry. I will be brief.
No, it's better.
First of all, I want to thank all the committee members for coming, for reading, for making so interesting comments, and so that we have quite an interesting defense this morning. So thank you very much for all your work, all of you. Now that this is the end, and I'm sure, well, as far as I understood, I have the feeling that the work of Marcus, his presentation, has probably already convinced most of you that Marcus was quite a brilliant young economist and young economic researcher. And I can confirm that this is also my feeling for having working with him along for a few years. When I organized the topic on which he was supposed to work, even before we met, because he was a candidate in the doctoral school, before we ever know each other, I have greatly underestimated the difficulty of organizing deliberative groups on two fields and with many people that have many other things to do than to participate in this field. And I was really impressed by all the energy and courage that he put in that. And I want to thank very much Mika, that without him, I'm sure many parts of the work have become maybe not impossible, but very, very difficult, and they were a very nice team to work on all the time. Marcus is also a very curious student and now researcher, and when Yves said that most of his information from Soutenance came from the National Park chart, I can testify that Marcus has many other kind of curiosity on reading and source of information to have a better understanding of the seven. But probably at the end, I didn't check, the main written sources that appear in the PhD is the PNC, the Seven National Park chart. But he knows very many things about sevens, and he spent a lot of time in the Seven, first of all to discover and then to organize the groups, meet people, try to convince them to come spend time, share their idea about sometimes uncomfortable subjects, because as you have understood, the people that know very well the Sevens are not always share the same idea of what the Seven should be or could be, and it is something a bit difficult to organize. And at the end, most of all, he obtained very interesting results. And it was not written at the beginning. We were not sure that such interesting results will be obtained in this process. To make a point, I'm not a believer in deliberation. The believer in the sense of theological state. And I'm very happy with the results he obtained. Because I often consider that there is some kind of optimism about what the deliberation will bring. But on the other hand, we all know that in the stated preferences approaches, there is a kind of optimism about what is in mind of the people that comply and enter the information in the questionnaire, and sometimes there is a suspicion that they can answer without really understanding what they answer to, and or the people that implement the questionnaire is sympathetic or not. Well, so we need this time of improving the information, improving the way people build and construct their preferences, and deliberation is of course a very attractive way to improve that way. And this is how this PhD was designed, was thought about, and always was very, with a lot of skills and talent implemented with by Marcus. So I will be brief because all the thing has already been very long. I can, two last words. The first one is to say that I was very, very happy for these 5 years working along with Marcus. He's indeed a very nice person, a very nice, a very promising citizen. And since I have heard that currently in Germany, there is quite a process about trying to make a coalition to govern the country. I'm not sure how to say in German, chancelier, but I don't believe that Marcus is interested to become the chancellering, like I said, the candidate. But I hope that there are many people in Germany as motivated to improve the public life, the public economics, as Marcus is, in order to have the country go to a better way, to continue on this very good way.
I mean, if he returns next week, he will be on
this
time.
Is why he's very much in a hurry. He's very expectant. And my nice point is, now that you have all a very deep understanding of the PhD of Marcus, a very good knowledge of what he did, how he did it, and you have all the time to discuss it. I really hope there is still enough misunderstanding between us that you could agree that it is a very nice work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for all these nice comments about the work.
So for the deliberation,
still one.
I think that we have to cut the streaming.
I think it's done by themselves.
I don't know if they can confirm that it's okay with them, but normally we will cut the Zoom transmission and only the other one, I don't know the name, will continue. And so we will have some time for a last deliberation about this work without Marcus.
Still, je pense l'équipe audiovisuelle m'avait dit qu'il me faut faire quelque chose de particulier, mais j'ai déjà oublié.
Mais il a dit ça, effectivement.
They will cut the image anyway.
This one? For your...
It's okay.
We should.
Are they all back? The Zoom listeners?
I should call the.
No.
Just there the number.
79 766.
D'accord. Donc, oui, c'est Marcus Kieslich, c'est donc pour. D'accord, super. Merci. So we are live.
C'est bon. C'est bon, c'est pas bon. Non. Donc, Monsieur Kieslich, le jury, après en avoir délibéré, a décidé de vous attribuer le grade de docteur de l'Université de Montpellier. Alors, je précise qu'il n'y a à l'Université de Montpellier plus aucune mention, donc pour le travail accompli, vous êtes digne du titre de docteur de l'Université de Montpellier. Félicitations et bonne continuation, en espérant avoir encore quelques contacts avec vous, tellement le contact a été appréciable, tellement vos qualités sont grandes, à la fois humaines, scientifiques. Donc bonne continuation. Félicitations. Faire le même en anglais.
Voilà. Merci, thank you all for the nice comments, for having been here. Merci à tout le monde qui m'a soutenu, les participants, l'équipe audiovisuelle. Merci à Yves. Et danke nochmal meiner Familie. Ja, vielen Dank. Thank you.
It's over.
we can move to
The restaurant. I have said one of. Well, I don't know how we can bring the restaurant to Yves.
Je me débrouiller.
Très bien.
So we have the pleasure to invite you for lunch. And since the defense is finished, Marcus and his wife will join us.
Yes, there was.
Both of you, even Manuel.
Yeah.
And I think also Mika, because I reserved 10 places and I have forgotten to adjust the number. So in any case, there are 3 places left. So.
Okay.
So Manuel has to eat like an adult person.
And you are going to celebrate this evening with your friends.
Yeah, I will celebrate. It's on Tuesday here, because I really wanted us to appreciate to discuss a little bit more. And as I will leave France, I wanted to separate the celebration of parting away with the member of the laboratory and having you. So I don't want it to make like a buffet for everybody, so that I can really appreciate once the committee and once the members of the laboratory.
It's for you.
Thank you.